Hello and welcome to this 5-minute overview. My name is Benjamin Attles and I work in the UK as a SharePoint Server Administrator. Today we're going to be discussing hostname site collections in SharePoint Foundation 2010. The motivation for this webcast was a bunch of queries I got on my blog over the last few months regarding hostname site collections. So why would one bother with the hostname site collection? Well, in the traditional approach, each web application typically gets its own URL, and this works absolutely fine for a typical corporate deployment. However, if you're planning on creating a lot of web applications, for example, if you did want to have separate URLs per client or per department, web applications do create a lot of additional overhead beyond that created by a site collection. So that includes timer jobs, for example. I think it's around 30 timer jobs are created per web application, depending on which version of SharePoint you're running. And also, invariably, if you're creating a separate web application, you'll also need to create another, at least one more content database. So here's a typical corporate deployment. We've got an intranet web application, a team sites web application, and a my sites web application. And you'll notice that each web app has its own unique URL. With hostname site collections, each site collection shares a single web application with a number of other site collections. So in this example, we've got customer A, B, and C. Each customer has its own URL. The benefit here is that we can scale to, a hell of a lot of site collections. We can have up to 100,000 hostname site collections within a single IIS site, or at least that's a documented Microsoft limit. And the point here is that we're scaling with multiple root level site collections, not web applications. And just to give you an idea, just for comparison, I believe the recommended limit, according to a couple of SharePoint MCMs that I've spoken to, they recommend that you have no more than 20 web applications per farm. So if you compare that to the hostname site collection limit I've got here, 100,000, that's a big difference. So site collections are a lot more scalable than web applications. The benefit here is that each customer gets its own URL, and what one could argue that the fact that you're using the same application pool and worker process is also a benefit, although there are a few drawbacks with this approach that I'll touch on later on. So let's jump into a demo. So here we are within Central Administration. I thought I'd just very quickly show you the options that are relevant on the web application creation screen. It's worth noting that there isn't really a host-named site collection mode as such when you're creating a web app. That's really just a logical concept, but there are a couple of options here that are very relevant. The first of which is the host header. Don't create one, basically. If you create a host header here, then and you bind it at the IIS site level, requests to your hostname site collections will be ignored. IIS will only listen to the host header that's bound at the IIS site level, so effectively leave that blank. The other option that's of interest is the public URL. Now, hostname site collections don't support alternate access mappings, as there is effectively only one zone here, the default zone. So it doesn't matter too much what URL you put in there, unless you're using SSL on your host-named site collections. If you do that, you'll need to specify a URL that adheres to your SSL certificate, and if you're going to be creating multiple hostname site collections in one web application using SSL, you'll need to use a wildcard SSL certificate for that. So rather than make you wait while I create the web app, I'll show you the one I created earlier. There's our shared web app, and I'm going to quickly show you how to create a hostname site collection. So the first point is that you must use PowerShell to do this. There is no interface for doing this to my knowledge. It's fairly simple. You basically just specify new-sp site, use that commandlet, specify the URL for your hostname site collection, which in this case is www.customerc.com, and then the last relevant parameter is the host header web application parameter that you must specify if you're trying to create a hostname site collection. Note that the web application URL is the same as that you saw in the web app creation screen just a second ago, and hopefully that works. While we're waiting for that, it's worth noting that while this might take between 5 and 10 seconds, say, this is comparable to creating a web application, and creating a web app might take between 5 and 10 minutes and introduce a lot of overheads, as I mentioned in the slides. So that's now created. I'm just going to flick over to the site collection list for that web app, and you can see that earlier on I created customer.a.com, customer.b.com, and we've now just created customer.c.com. Now you may notice that we haven't actually selected a web template here. We've just literally created a kind of skeleton site collection, if you like. Now, the first time you visit your hostname site collection, in this case customer.a.com, you'll be prompted to select a template. So in this case we'll select a team site for customer A, and let's select a blank site for customer B, just so there's a bit of a difference between the two. Again, that's done. I'm just going to select the default options because I'm about to wrap up this video demo, and I'm just going to switch back to the slides very quickly before the end of this 5-minute overview. So just to wrap up, we've got 3 hostname site collections, all contained within one application. And if I just quickly show you within IIS, you can see, hopefully, that there's just one IIS site. So a lot less overhead there, and 3 site collections, all with their own vanity URLs. So I think it's worth touching on a few of the caveats and limitations of using hostname site collections. The first of which is that site collections within a single web application share certain resources that are global to the web app. For example, the web.config. This means that for hosters, it's pretty much not an option to allow changes that might affect other clients. For example, if a client wanted to add Ajax extensions to a web.config file in SharePoint 2007, this would have affected other clients. Of course, that's native in SharePoint 2010, but that's just an example. There's no support for alternate access mappings. This means that you can effectively only have one URL per site collection. Of course, if you're using a traditional path-based site collection approach, you can of course use up to 5 zones with alternate access mappings. This is not possible with hostname site collections. They don't support HTTP and HTTPS or SSL connections simultaneously, so again for that you have to break out your HTTPS sites into a separate web application. So to summarise, hostname site collections are really very scalable compared to web applications, and I would highly recommend them if you're planning on implementing a large number of vanity URLs. That means of course that they're great for hosters. They are effectively a part of the multi-tenant solution in SharePoint 2010, and it's worth remembering that Microsoft implemented it themselves for Office 365 or SharePoint Online, whatever you want to call it these days. Well, that pretty much wraps it up. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you do have any comments or feedback or requests for the future, please let me know on my blog in the comments. Cheers!